Ish.
Yeah.
He was ready to record.
I did, yes. I just did that. Yeah.
No, she just said
I would not.
No, Sean, you can.
Okay, yeah. So we had a UI UX talk like a year ago that Sean gave about style components. And since then, it seems like all of us have at least played with it a little bit or are familiar with the concepts. So I wanted to do this follow-up talk on the things I've learned using them for the past year. And I wanted to go a little bit deeper, talk about kind of the technology behind it and some of the best practices that I've discovered. So, and then we'll demo some of the new features. Style components are possible because of tag template literals. So we're all familiar with template literals, which allow you to interpolate some variable into a string. But you might not be as familiar with tagged template literals, which are a way to parse template literals with a function. So you can see here on the left, we have that style.div backtick, and that's pretty much equivalent to what's underneath, which is just a regular old function invocation with parentheses. But the difference is really in how they handle arguments. So I wanted to show that really quickly, do a little demo of what it looks like when you pass these two different functions arguments. So first I'm going to create a logger function, and that is just going to loop through, or sorry, it's just going to log all the parameters it received to the console. It's hard to type and look over there. Actually. We have this logger function, and then I'm going to create a template literal, so I'll need a variable to interpolate. So we'll say name, and then we'll just pass a regular old template literal here.
Can't help but seeing that.
Yeah, I was
gonna do. World. Yeah, I know that song.
I know, I'm just lame. So we just get a regular old string, not surprising. So if we do the same exact thing with a tag template literal, arguments are a little bit different. So we have this array of strings, which are our string literals, and then the following arguments are all of the interpolations. So now I'm going to just quickly update this logger function, which I probably can't do because okay, so I'm going to, this time, instead of just logging the parameters, I'm going to loop through all of them. And for each parameter, I'm going to log not only that parameter, but the type of it. Okay, does that look like it'll work? Okay. All right, so then we'll do the same thing now, but I'm going to pass it a function. So we'll do test, and then I'm going to just pass it an inline function. And then, really throwing me off to like look over here. Okay, so if we do that, it's just a string. Everything's been stringified, including the function. But if we do this, we see the first thing is that array, which is an object, and it's split on the interpolation here. But then the second argument is an actual function. It's the original function that we passed to the tag template literal. And so basically that's how styled components works under the hood. It's at render time, it passes the props into all those interpolated functions to allow you to change your styles dynamically. So that's really the kind of what made it happen. So get rid of this. Okay, so let's keep going. So if we zoom out for a second and talk about how that fits in with like the whole life cycle, there are two main parts, right? So we have when you create a style component and then when you actually render it. So when you import style components, it first creates an internal counter, and that counts all of the components created via your styled function there. And then it creates this like internal identifier called component ID, and it does that by hashing the counter value for that component. And in case anyone's wondering, they use a murmur hash algorithm to do that. I didn't know what that was. But so then it actually inserts a new HTML style element into the head of your document. So you can see in that second example, the style tag with data style components, and it leaves a comment with the component ID it just created. And that's important because that's how it marks the position and keeps the integrity of the cascade, so for specificity reasons. And then next, React component is actually created, and it inherits a bunch of lifecycle methods from this base style component class. And that class has a lot of this interesting stuff is done in the component will mount of that base style component method. And what it does is first parses that tag template literal. So this is an example of what that might look like if we were passing in the, if we were rendering, let's say, this card component here. This is what the arguments might actually look like for that. So we have that array of strings split on the interpolations and then the functions. Okay, so it gets these arguments, it parses the string literals, and then it passes the props, invokes them, and then inserts those resulting values from those functions back into the string. And then what it does, it uses Stylus, that CSS preprocessor, to turn it into a real CSS. And then once it's completed generating the CSS rules, the next thing it's responsible for is actually creating a class name that reflects the specific instance of that style component. So you might think that was what the component ID was, but the component ID there reflects the base component, and it's used to quickly identify which style component a DOM element belongs to, but it doesn't actually have any styles attached to it. So it creates the actual class name by hashing the component ID and the generated styles. And so each prop that you add, it generates a new class name for that prop. So it has to go through all of this again for each prop you add. And then we can actually now inject the styles because we have the class name, we have the resulting styles, and it uses the comment it left earlier here. You can see there like grid E4TE with, this is the base component marker, so no styles there, and then it will attach class name here. So every time you create a prop, it will like keep adding things. So that's another reason like to not if you have really, really dynamic styles, there's workarounds for that, because it will, if you're changing props, 100 times a second, like you have a slider or something and you're generating a lot, it'll yell at you if you start adding too many class names. Okay, so then in the render method of the component, all it has to do now is just render whatever tag you told it to, and whether it's div or button, and then it'll add as the class name, it'll concatenate like the component ID, the generated class name, and then any additional class names you might have passed it. So that's basically it. Like that's how it works. And I thought it was kind of cool because it's not that complicated actually, like really how it works. And it seems like there could be a lot of good use cases for the tag template literal thing. Yeah, I was thinking about like internationalization too. It could be a good use case for it.
Or we're using like WYSIWYG editor that has like HTML inside text.
Yeah, I could see that.
I'm really confused on what point you guys are talking about.
I'm just saying like the idea of tag template literals in general, where you can, like just to parse interpolated values, like it, and get the original values back and not like a stringified version of it, could be
As a
useful
pattern.
as a pattern. Yes.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
we're using in
Right.
Java, just like,
Great. Okay, so that's kind of how it works. And I thought now I would talk about some best practices that I've found. And while I was kind of coming up with those things, I was thinking about why, why I think these are best practices. And so I thought about how style components allow us to think about styles as components, as the name suggests. So that means we can kind of take lessons from component-based architecture and apply them here. So I'm going to talk about a few guiding principles and then show some real examples that demonstrate them. So the first one is single responsibility. We're in the business of microservices, so hopefully we're all pretty familiar with that concept. Basically, like a component should do one thing and do it well, and if it ends up growing, it should be decomposed into smaller subcomponents. And then we have identify discrete UI states that the component needs to satisfy. So in other words, when creating a component, it's really good to think about, think through every state that a component needs to satisfy. For example, like I have that card component, it has an open state and a closed state, and I need to derive styles based on those states. And then the last point is reusability. So a potential danger with component architecture is that although it encourages reusability and single responsibility, it can often lead to kind of unmaintainable code if you do it wrong. Like if you design things to be too reusable, it ends up making your code unreadable, and it might not be worth it in the end. So I try to consider the reusability of a component carefully, and I found it's helpful to ask these questions, like, does it have an extremely specific use case, or can it just be hard-coded for that case? Does it need to be reused throughout the whole application, or does it need to be able to work in any context, like when I'm designing something for the component library? So basically, in short, don't default to making things as reusable as possible just for the hell of it, because there are trade-offs with that, and it's not necessarily better to make things as reusable as possible. Okay, so one of my first best practices that I try to follow is to keep props state-oriented, which means avoiding props that shadow CSS properties. So in this example, notice there are a few props that do just that. They shadow the CSS properties like flex, padding, flex direction, and then they provide a default. And the props here suggest that this component can have a ton of different states. And the downside here is that this can encourage the developer to mutate it to the point that it might not even reflect like the original intention of that component. So although we can create components that are really flexible, that doesn't necessarily mean we should, because it can break that single responsibility principle. And of course, I'm not saying you should never write props for individual style rules. This is just a pattern I generally try to avoid, and I've found that I usually can. So it also goes back to the second principle, which is to create components that satisfy discrete UI states. And I can kind of draw a parallel here to regular React component development, like the concept of core state versus derived state. Is everyone kind of familiar with that concept, like core versus derived? I mean,
No, can you say more?
yeah, so
Does that mean that
Are there other names for that?
That's how I've seen it mostly referred to, but basically the idea is like, if you have, like, say, a to-do list component, you might keep like an array of to-dos in your state. You probably would not also do this, where you keep the length of the to-do in state, right? That's like a derived property of the state. So, especially because like you would never mutate the length apart from the array, like they're connected. You would derive the number from the length of the array. And so in styling, I kind of think.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
What if it's something like median? Something which is derived a little hard to get on the fly.
I mean, well, I guess in Reactlet, I would probably use something like get derived state from props for that, where I can do that logic and then set it there. That's probably what I would do. I guess I'm not sure in this like parallel example I'm trying to draw with styling, but yeah. So I guess what I'm trying to say, like the parallel idea is considering your discrete UI states as like the core state, like open and closed, and then thinking about like these style properties as derived from those states. So like in this case, like the derived state would be the flex direction padding, and you don't want to edit that independently of the state of the UI. So thinking first in kind of state-oriented and these properties as derived from UI state. So that's kind of my rule about that. Okay, so in real life, UIs are complicated and sometimes you need escape hatches, but in my opinion, there are better ways to do that. So first, you can inline styles, and an important thing to know about style components is that they will always pass through known HTML attributes to the DOM, so to that DOM element, so you can always use that style prop as an escape hatch. And if you have more than one or two styles, then you can just extend the component. And as Karina was saying, the extend property is being deprecated in the new release, so you can see here I use the style factory function to take our original item display, and I named it settings icon display, and added some more styles. Okay, so when I first started, Sean yelled at me for doing this, and I have come to the light. I think nested ternaries especially are gross, and maybe in programming in general, not just style components. But like this, you can see here this padding declaration is dependent on two different props, and it can cause errors really easily if you're not careful, and it's you can usually avoid it if you try. So next, you can, just like with your normal React components, you should use prop types, and it reduces unexpected behavior in your application, and it's great code documentation, and definitely use the is required option if a style declaration depends on that prop being defined. It's very handy. So you can use, like I said, use the style function to add additional styles to any component. The caveat being, like, as long as internally that third-party component passes a class name down to the rendered DOM node. So here I'm importing a button from GenUI components, and I'm attaching additional styles there. So you can do the same thing with a regular old React component too. Like if this wasn't imported from a library, but I had like function button and I was doing like some sort of stateless functional component here, I could also attach props to that too, just like I'm doing here. But it's usually, I usually try to avoid that because it sort of reverses, like it inverses the order of kind of architectural components with styling components. So yeah, it's not hard to avoid that either.
Well, it can sometimes like be really useful, especially like if you want to use different types of elements to that use like similar linking function? Like
Yeah, I definitely didn't. I did it this week actually because I had something where it was like, I had kind of a more complicated React component, and the whole thing needed to change styles based on state, and it was just easier if I could keep all of the functionality but just attach on a few different styles to it. So definitely handy. So nested rules are a feature intentionally ported from Sass. So if you have HTML elements that maybe only have like 1 or 2 style rules and you don't want to create a whole component for just like a span with padding, just move that selector to the parent. And another feature I discovered recently is the component selector pattern. So on the right here, I'm actually importing the icon arrow up component and using the constructor to select it. Also has come in handy. Okay, so you can use the attribute helper to attach additional props to a style component. And the rule of thumb is just use the attributes method when you want every instance of that style component to have that attribute. So like in this case, we have an input and we always want that input to have the type range. So this way we don't have to specify that type every single time we want to use the input. However, like I mentioned earlier, style components automatically forwards known DOM attributes. So you can always just pass those and know that they'll end up on the DOM node. So like on the left, that part is unnecessary, default value and disable, because that will automatically pass through. You don't have to do that. So I mentioned this a little bit, but the attributes helper can also be used as a workaround for really highly dynamic styles, and this is the recommended workaround for that. So like if you had a component, like they said, like a slider that changed the background color when you slid it, every time you pass a new prop, it'll append that class to your style tag like we saw originally. So if you get to, I think, 200 unique class names, style components will yell at you. So this is the recommended workaround where you use the attributes helper to inline the style instead of using a prop. I haven't really ever run into this, but good to know. So this is also something I've never actually seen anyone do, but it's just good to know. Like, make sure you don't do this. Define your style components outside of a render method, because otherwise it'll be recreated on every pass, and it will, thwart your caching and all that good stuff. Okay, so tooling. So since this library started to gain popularity, there have been a lot of really great tools around it, and I just wanted to highlight 4 that I've used regularly. If you're using this in your project, you probably know about all this, but first, there's a Babel plugin, and it adds support for server-side rendering, minification, and gives you a lot better debugging experience by actually attaching the component name to the randomly generated class name. And that way, when you are in DevTools, you can see what component was rendered. Next is Jest style components, which allow better snapshot testing. So normally, if you took a snapshot of a style component, it would just show you the DOM element with that randomly generated class name, which is not very helpful to know like what styles that applies to. But this package actually will print out the styles for you, so you can see what styles were applied or not applied to that element. Yeah.
I was gonna say that. Do you know if the VS Code style components, if that has been updated for the beta yet?
I don't think so, because I was noticing when I used the global style thing, it didn't highlight it.
Okay.
So yeah, I don't think so. Probably.
Pull requests.
Yeah. Yeah, and then it has the 2F style rule method, which is great for testing that like props are actually generating the styles you expect. And then finally, just linting and this plugin, which gives you syntax highlighting. So good stuff. Okay, so that's basically all the slides I have, but I wanted to just demonstrate some, oh no, wait, I do have another slide, just kidding. So new stuff in 4.0, we have a new API for implementing global styles. the as prop, which lets you take styles, use the styles from one style component that you created, but use it on a different element. So you can like, if you define a style.button style component, but then all of those same exact styles applied to maybe an input, you could say like, I don't know, you could render button as input, although that would be very confusing. So I'll show some use cases for that. But yeah, deprecated component.extend, deprecated inner ref. So usually in the past, to pass a ref, you would have to use inner ref so that it didn't, I guess, collide with the React ref and get lost there. But since React updated the ref API, I think it's now possible to just use ref instead of inner ref, and dropping support for React 15. So that's a thing that's happening. Okay, so I made this little app, and I wanted to just show. Okay, so, So first, let's show the global style API. So the cool thing about this is now the global styles actually live in the context of your, in the render tree or the React tree, like within your components. So that means that it can be styled, it can be, it can be themed, it can receive props. So there's a lot more flexibility with that now. So I've rendered it here. So this is what it looks like. I'm defining a color property for everything, and so you see I'm using a theme to do that. So that, and if I wanted to pass other props, I could do that too. And then I wanted to quickly show the as prop. So where am I using that? Okay, so this is a little Jeopardy app, and I have a question card, which is a div. So I have a couple different versions of this. So this is the base card, which is a div, and then I wanted to use all those styles plus a few more, so I'm extending it here. But maybe I would want to change the underlying element because I'm using it as a like action item instead of a GIF, so if I need to click on it. So I guess maybe I'll just show the app first, which is here. So if oh yeah. Okay, so I just.
Is this a review? Are you going to review us with this?
What do you mean? Oh yeah.
Oh my god. This is so cool.
Okay, so let me look. What am I looking for? Okay, right. So I just wanted to show like all of the cards. They are divs, and then if I use the as prop, I want to make them all buttons instead. Now I do that. You can see they're all buttons. Very fancy, very fancy. So that makes a little bit more sense. I guess, oh yeah, and then themes. So
We gotta do the button.
no, I think I'll keep it.
Okay. If you have to use code climate, the as property will help you get rid of a lot of code climate complaints when they'll see similar blocks of code that are different types of style elements.
Interesting.
Things like heck.
No, it allows you to more easily reuse styles that appear in different types of elements. So remember when you were like, why don't you use these styles again in the documentation site? I was like, I can't because they're different elements. But now you can.
So the other work, well, there was a way you could do that with the old API. You could use the with component.
It was way more
Class, but-
cumbersome though
yeah.
than it is now.
You still had to create a new component for
Yeah,
it.
but now you don't. You
Yeah.
can literally just be like, add blah, blah.
But honestly, I don't know how I feel about that because like I was saying earlier, like if you had a button and then you wanted to use it as those styles as an input, like then it wouldn't really make very much sense if you looked at that code and saw a button with like as input.
Right.
It would be like very,
But HTML
so-
has like a lot of elements like nav, where you could just use a div.
right. So in that case, yeah, for sure. It can be, I'm just saying, I guess it could be misused, but,
Yeah, I can see it being used.
right,
Like, maybe this example is a bit inspired with like,
yeah.
but it's probably better to explicitly use a button component versus
Right.
translating into a div to a button.
I mean, it's not really, I mean, what do you mean by translated?
The JSX component was a div, right?
Yeah.
And you're saying render it as a button instead.
Well, I mean, it kind of goes back to like
It's not just
that,
the button style is actually rendering a button.
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Seems a little.
No, I mean, it's pretty useful because like I have to switch back between div and span and to specify something as an inline element.
Yeah.
And
I think
like
that
that's
sounds
super useful. I mean, obviously you don't want collision like between like button and input because there are like attributes like not legal.
Yeah.
But like, so right when we talked about like under the hood, it's just seeing which element you passed it and then rendering that. So it's not like it's switching it out or anything. It's just rendering it as that,
Okay.
right? Like,
I probably haven't used it enough to understand it.
well, so anyways, I'm just going to show theming really quick. So this is kind of what we're trying to do with the component library, but basically Style Components offers this theme provider. This is not anything new, by the way, with 4.0, but you have this theme provider, you pass it your theme, which is literally just an object. These are my two themes. And then your app will receive that through context. So let's switch it out and just see this other pretty theme that I made. Wow, beautiful. And look, only these things change, so it's pretty powerful. And so yeah, anyways, this is what we're trying to do with the component library. So the idea is like the component library would offer these themes to import, and then you would just import your own theme provider from Style Components and pass it in.
Very cool.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah. So the idea was like the other week, I guess it's been, since this has been postponed, it's been like a month now, but there was this like pretty intense Twitter drama about CSS, started by the guy who created Style Components, Max Stoiber, and he asked this question about specificity. So, and like it was a lot of drama because everybody got it, like the majority of people got it wrong. And everyone was like, if you're not a real developer, if you can't answer this question, and then he's like, no, but CSS doesn't matter, who cares? So I guess maybe I should try to find it. Well, so yeah. The idea was basically that a div had like a class, two classes, blue and red. And then the CSS had, a blue class and a red class, and it was just asking what color the div would be. So the trick of it was that like whatever is defined last in the style sheet, like the bottom of the cascade, that's the color that would be applied. So it was like blue in that case. Yes, if it has both. Right. So in that case, they had equal specificity. And so whatever is last in the cascade wins. But yeah, a lot of people got it wrong. So I thought like maybe it'd be fun to, I don't know, see where we're at with our CSS knowledge.
Yeah. This is like, you know, no CSS quiz. I don't know if this is direction, you know,
We'll see.
CSS. I don't think so.
Okay, so we're gonna do 2 teams.
Let's just sign that side.
State draft.
No, everybody online, everybody who's here.
Yeah,
So we get you know the answers, right?
and then, okay, so
You're on our team.
so we have 7 people. Who's like,
I'm fine not playing.
do you wanna do 3 and 3?
Sure. No, you should play.
I'm good.
You